Hmm. Let's just move closer here. So, it's been a few days. I've been very busy. Haven't had time, or maybe been too tired to read book, and that's pretty troubling because my little homework is due in about a month. So I'm really gonna get going because this is like, what is it, 500 pages in 30 days? That's gonna be like 10. I gotta do 10 pages per day in order to meet that. I know that's not too much, but like, given how busy I've been, it would be uh it would be not dependable for me to just be confident. Like, I'm not confident in saying I can reach that goal of merely doing 10 pages a day just because I'm so busy, you know? So, let's at least put a dent in it today. And we've done the prologue. Hopefully I still remember that. That was about, like, this one person with leukemia or whatever, right? I remember because it's the atom bomb disease, and, like, that was a big part of this one passage I had to teach in English when I was a tutor. It was about this myth, not myth, but like a contemporary legend about like this one girl who had to fold 1,000 cranes for no particular reason. I don't believe in hope. Anyways. Alright, let's get on to the book. Part 1 of Black Color Without Boiling. And it's in this strange spelling you can see here of black color without boiling. Interesting. And there's a quote from the Sherlock Holmes in the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's A Study in Scarlet. In solving a problem of this sort, the grand thing is to be able to reason backwards. That is a very useful accomplishment and a very easy one, but people do not practice it much. What is it? Be able to reason backwards. I should heed his advice, but honestly, I don't have the energy right now. Anyways, part 1. Each part is in different chapters. And these chapters are pretty small, so I should be able to get a few of them done today. Let's aim for finishing Onkos. That starts on page 46, and we're at page 11. Anyways, the first. Oh, I should move you away from the corner of my bed. I don't want you to fall fucking 5 feet, dude. The first subsection, or I should say the first chapter of this first part, is called A Separation of Blood. And there is another. Oh, there are 2 quotes here. One is from Hilaire Belloc. Physicians of the utmost fame were called at once, but when they came, they answered as they took their fees, "There is no cure for this disease." That's very funny. I love myself a funny poem. And there is another from William Castle describing leukemia in 1950. Very recent. Oh, almost 100 years ago. Oh, I'm getting old. Its palliation is a daily task. Its cure a fervent hope. Very cool. I love that. Anyways, let's go into the chapter. In a damp 14 by 20 foot laboratory in Boston on a December morning in 1947, a man named Sidney Farber waited impatiently for the arrival of a parcel from New York. The laboratory was little more than a chemist's closet, a poorly ventilated room buried in the half-basement of the Children's Hospital, almost thrust into its back alley. I've thrust lots of things into my back alley. Anyways, a few hundred feet away, the hospital's medical wards were slowly thrumming to work. Children in white smocks moved restlessly on small wrought iron cots. Doctors and nurses shuttled busily between the rooms, checking carts, writing orders, and dispensing medicines. But Farber's lab was listless and empty, a bare warren of chemicals and glass. Oh, fuck. Sorry, I moved too much. I was masturbating too violently. But Farber's lab was listless and empty, a bare warren of chemicals and glass jars connected to the main hospital through a series of icy corridors. The sharp stench of embalming formalin wafted through the air. There was no patience in the rooms here, just the bodies and tissues of patients brought down through the tunnels for autopsies and examinations. Farber was a pathologist. His job involved dissecting specimens, performing autopsies, identifying cells, and diagnosing diseases, but never treating patients. Farber's specialty was pediatric pathology, the study of children's diseases. He had spent nearly 20 years in these subterranean rooms, staring obsessively down his microscope and climbing through the academic ranks to become chief of pathology at Children's. But for Farber, pathology was becoming a disjunctive form of medicine, a discipline more preoccupied with the dead than the living. Farber now felt impatient watching illness from its sidelines, never touching or treating a live patient. He was tired of tissues and cells. He felt trapped, embalmed in his own glassy cabinet. Ooh, what a parallel. Him being embalmed and his subjects being embalmed as well. Ooh, that's very nice. I love that. I know that's very obvious. Only a genius like me could have ever discerned it. Anyways, let's keep going. And so, I should, and so, Farber had decided to make a drastic professional switch. Instead of squinting at inert specimens under his lens, he would try to leap into the life of the clinics upstairs, from the microscopic world that he knew so well into the magnified real world of patients and illnesses. He would try to use the knowledge he had gained from his pathological specimens to devise new therapeutic interventions. The parcel from New York. Oh, this was about a parcel, right? I see. The parcel from New York contained a few vials of a yellow crystalline chemical named aminopterin. It had been shipped to his laboratory in Boston on the slim hope that it might halt the growth of leukemia in children. And that was our break. That was our first break. Alright, let's keep on going. We've only gone so little, so let's keep going. Had Farber asked any of the pediatricians circulating in the wards above him about the likelihood of developing an anti-leukemic drug, they would have advised him not to bother trying. Childhood leukemia had fascinated, confused, and frustrated doctors for more than a century. The disease had been analyzed, classified, subclassified, and subdivided meticulously. In the musty, leather-bound books on the library shelves at Children's, Anderson's Pathology or Boyd's Pathology of Internal Diseases. Page upon page was plastered with images of leukemia cells and appended with elaborate taxonomies to describe them. Yet all this knowledge only amplified the sense of medical helplessness. The disease had turned into an object of empty fascination, a wax museum doll, studied and photographed in exquisite detail, but without any therapeutic or practical advances. It gave physicians plenty to wrangle over at medical meetings, an oncologist recalled, but it did not help their patients at all. A patient with acute leukemia was brought to the hospital in a flurry of excitement, discussed in medical rounds with professorial grandiosity, and then, as a medical magazine dryly noted, diagnosed, transfused, and sent home to die. The study of leukemia had been mired in confusion and despair ever since its discovery. On March 19, 1845, a Scottish physician, John Bennett, had described an unusual case. A 28-year-old slate layer with a mysterious swelling in his spleen. He is of dark complexion, Bennett wrote of his patient, usually healthy and temperate. He states that 20 months ago, he was affected with great listlessness on exertion, which has continued to this time. In June, he noticed a tumor in the left side of his abdomen, which has gradually increased in size till 4 months since, when they became stationary. The slate layer's tumor might have reached its final... Oh, slate layer. Someone who lays slates. Oh, right. The slate layer's tumor might have reached its final stationary point, but his constitutional troubles only accelerated. Over the next few weeks, Bennett's patient spiraled from symptom to symptom. Fevers, flashes of bleeding, sudden fits of abdominal pain, gradually at first, and then on a tighter, faster arc, careening from one bout to another. Soon the slate layer was on the verge of death, with more swollen tumors sprouting in his armpits, his groin, and his neck. He was treated with the customary leeches and purging, but to no avail. At the autopsy a few weeks later, Bennett was convinced he had found the reason behind the symptoms. His patient's blood was chock full of white blood cells. White blood cells, the typical constituent of pus, typically signal the response to an infection, and Bennett reasoned that the slate layer had succumbed to one. The following case seems to me particularly valuable, he wrote self-assuredly, as it will serve to demonstrate the existence of true pus, formed universally within the vascular system. I will call it pus, I will not call it pus, because I want to irritate you. It would have been a perfectly satisfactory explanation, except that Bennett could not find the source for the pus. During the necropsy, he pored carefully through the body, combing the tissues and organs for signs of abscess or wound. But no other stigmata of infection was to be found, The blood had apparently spoiled, separated of its own will, combusted spontaneously in the true puss. A separation of blood, Bennett called his case, and he left it at that. Bennett was wrong, of course, about a spontaneous separation of blood. A little over 4 months after Bennett had described the Slater's illness, a 24-year-old German researcher, Rudolf Virchow, independently published a case report with striking similarities to Bennett's case. Virchow's patient was a cook in her mid-50s. White blood cells had explosively overgrown her blood, forming dense and pulpy pools in her spleen. Ew. At her autopsy, pathologists had likely not even needed a microscope to distinguish the thick, milky layer of white cells floating above the red. Virchow, who knew of Bennett's case, couldn't bring himself to believe Bennett's theory. Blood, Virchow argued, had no reason to transform impetuously into anything. Moreover, the unusual symptoms bothered him. What of the massively enlarged spleen, or the absence of any wound or source of pus in the body? Virchow began to wonder if the blood itself was abnormal. Unable to find a unifying explanation for it, and seeking a name for this condition, Virchow ultimately settled for Weißes Blut, white blood, no more than a literal description of the millions of white cells he had seen under his microscope. In 1847, he changed the name to the more academic-sounding leukemia, from leukos, the Greek word for white. And that's another break. Ooh, lovely. It breaks every, 2 pages? Oh, how kind. They shouldn't have. Oh, I just peeked at the next few pages and my eyes just locked upon the word vomiting. I'm gonna have such a great time for this book. Alright, let's keep going. I actually want to finish this because we only have 5 more pages in this chapter? Alright. Had Farber asked any of the pediatricians circulating in the wards above him about the... Oh shit, fuck me. Yeah, there we go. Too many breaks, man. I got the pages confused. Renaming the disease from the florid separation to blood to the flat Weißes Blut hardly seems like an act of scientific genius, but it had a profound impact on the understanding of leukemia. An illness at the moment of its discovery is a fragile idea, a hothouse flower, deeply disproportionately influenced by names and classifications. More than a century later, in the early 1980s, another change in name from, gay-related immune disease, or GRID, to acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, AIDS, would signal an epic shift in the understanding of that disease. Gay-related. Well, there is some truth to it, you know? Like Bennett, Virchow didn't understand leukemia, but unlike Bennett, he didn't pretend to understand it. His insight lay entirely in the negative. By wiping the slate clean of all preconceptions, he cleared the field for thought. Oh, look at that. By wiping the slate clean. He laid the slate and then he wiped it clean. Ooh, the slate layer, right? Ooh, the parallels in this. Ooh. The humility of the name and the underlying humility about his understanding of cause epitomized Virchow's approach to medicine. As a young professor at the University of Würzburg, Virchow's work soon extended far beyond naming leukemia. A pathologist by training, he launched a project that would occupy him for the rest of his life: describing human diseases in simple cellular terms. It was a project born of frustration. Virchow entered medicine in the early 1840s, when nearly every disease was attributed to the workings of some invisible force: miasmas, neuroses, bad humors, and hysterias. Perplexed by what he couldn't see, Virchow turned with revolutionary zeal to what he could see: cells under the microscope. In 1838, Matthias Schleiden, a botanist, and Theodor Schwann, a physiologist, both working in Germany, had claimed that all living organisms were built out of fundamental building blocks called cells. Borrowing and extending this idea, Virchow set out to create a cellular theory of human biology, basing it on two fundamental tenets. First, that human bodies, like the bodies of all animals and plants, were made of cells. Second, that cells only arose from other cells. Omnis cellula e cellula, as he put it, because he's a nerd and he likes, Latin? The two tenets might have seemed simplistic, but they allowed Virchow to propose a crucially important hypothesis about the nature of human growth. If cells only arose from other cells, then growth could occur in only two ways, either by increasing cell numbers or by increasing cell size. Virchow called these two modes hyperplastia and hypertrophy. In hypertrophy, the number of cells did not change. Instead, each individual cell merely grew in size, like a balloon being blown up. Hyperplasia, in contrast, was grown by virtue of cells increasing in number. Every growing human tissue could be described in terms of hypertrophy and hyperplasia. I don't even know how to pronounce that latter one. In adult animals, fat and muscle usually grow by hypertrophy. In contrast, the liver, the blood, the gut, and the skin all grow through hyperplasia. Cells becoming more cells. Omnis cellula e cellula e cellula. Fucking Latin, man. I feel like I'm the Pope when I speak Latin, and I don't want to be the Pope. That explanation was persuasive, and it provoked a new understanding not just of normal growth, but of pathological growth as well. Like normal growth, pathological growth could also be achieved through hypertrophy and hyperplasia. When the heart muscle is forced to push against the blocked aortic outlet, it often adapts by making every muscle cell bigger to generate more force. What the fuck? Eventually resulting in a heart so overgrown that it may be unable to function normally. Pathological hypertrophy. Conversely, and importantly for the story, Virchow soon stumbled upon the quintessential disease of pathological hyperplasia: cancer. Looking at cancerous growth through his microscope, Virchow discovered an uncontrolled growth of cells, hyperplasia in its extreme form. As Virchow examined the architecture of cancers, the growth often seemed to have acquired a life of its own, as if the cells had become possessed by a new and mysterious drive to grow. This was not just ordinary growth, but growth redefined, growth in a new form. Presciently, although oblivious of the mechanism, Virchow called it neoplasia, novel, inexplicable, distorted growth, a word that would ring through the history of cancer. By the time Virchow died in 1902, a new theory of cancer had slowly coalesced out of all these observations. Cancer was a disease of pathological hyperplasia, in which cells acquired an autonomous will to divide. This aberrant, uncontrolled cell division created masses of tissue, or tumors, that invaded organisms and destroyed normal tissues. These tumors could also spread from one site to another, causing outcroppings of the disease, called metastases, in distant sites, such as their bones, the brain, or the lungs. Cancer came in diverse forms: breast, stomach, skin, and cervical cancer, leukemias, and lymphomas. But all these diseases were deeply connected at the cellular level. In every case, cells had all acquired the same characteristic: uncontrollable, pathological cell division. With this understanding, pathologists who studied leukemia in the late 1880s now circled back to Virchow's work. Leukemia, then, was not a separation of blood, but neoplasia in blood. Bennett's earlier fantasy had germinated an entire field of fantasies among scientists who had gone searching and duly found all sorts of invisible parasites and bacteria bursting out of leukemia cells. But once pathologists stopped looking for infectious causes and refocused their lenses on the disease, they discovered the obvious analogies between leukemia cells and cells of other forms of cancer. Leukemia was a malignant proliferation of white cells in the blood. It was cancer in a molten liquid form. Ew. With that seminal observation, the study of leukemias plural, suddenly found clarity and spurted forward. Spurted. By the early 1900s, it was clear that the disease came in several forms. It could be chronic and indolent, slowly choking the bone marrow and spleen, as is shown in Virchow's original case, later termed chronic leukemia, or it could be acute and violent, almost a different illness in its personality, with flashes of fever, paroxysmal fits of bleeding, and a dazzlingly rapid overgrowth of cells, as in Bennett's patient. This second version of the disease, called acute leukemia, came in two further subtypes, based on the type of cancer cell involved. Normal white cells in the blood can be broadly divided into two types of cells: myeloid cells or lymphoid cells. Acute myeloid leukemia, or AML, was a cancer of the myeloid cells. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, or ALL, was cancer of immature lymphoid cells. Cancers of more mature lymphoid cells are called lymphomas. Oh, that's very nice. In children, leukemia was most common ALL, lymphoblastic leukemia, and was almost always swiftly lethal. In 1860, a student of Virchow's, Michael Anton Biermer, described the first known case of this form in childhood leukemia. Maria Speyer, an energetic, vivacious, and playful five-year-old daughter of a Würzburg carpenter, was initially seen at the clinic because she had become lethargic in school and developed bloody bruises on her skin. The next morning, she developed a stiff neck and a fever, precipitating a call to Biermer for a home visit. That night, Biermer drew a drop of blood from Maria's veins, looked at the smear using a candlelit bedside microscope, and found millions of leukemia cells in the blood. Maria slept fitfully late into the evening. Late the next afternoon, as Biermer was excitedly showing his colleagues the specimens of exquisite fall von leukemie, an exquisite case of leukemia, Maria vomited bright red blood and lapsed into a coma. By the time Biermer returned to her house this evening, the child had been dead for several hours. From its first symptom to diagnosis to death, her galloping, relentless illness had lasted no more than 5 days. 3 days. Oh, no. Man. Back when you could die in 3 days. Now it takes, what? A few years? I don't know. Although nowhere near, there is a break just then. And this is the shortest section ever. Here's a break in the next page. Oh, there's another break. Cool. Alright, let's do this. Although nowhere as aggressive as Maria Spire's leukemia, Carla's illness was astonishing in its own right. Carla? Who the fuck's Carla? Give me a second. Oh, Carla from the Prelude. Oh, really? We had to read the Prelude? I thought you could skip the Prelude. Oh, cool. Okay. Alright. Although nowhere as aggressive as Maria Spire's leukemia, Carla's illness was astonishing in its own right. Adults, on average, have about 5,000 white blood cells circulating per microliter of blood. Carla's blood contained 90,000 cells per microliter, nearly 20-fold the normal level. 95% of these cells were blasts, malignant lymphoid cells produced at a frenetic pace, but unable to mature into fully developed lymphocytes. In acute lymphoblastic leukemia, as in some other cancers, the overproduction of cancer cells is combined with mysterious arrest in the normal maturation of cells. Lymphoid cells are thus produced in vast excess, but unable to mature, they cannot fulfill their normal function in fighting microbes. Carla had immunological poverty in the face of plenty. Ooh, that's very nice. White blood cells are produced in the bone marrow. Carla's bone marrow biopsy, which I saw under the microscope the morning after I first met her, was deeply abnormal. Although superficially amorphous, bone marrow is a highly organized tissue, an organ in truth, that generates blood in adults. Typically, bone marrow biopsies contain spicules of bone, and within these spicules, islands of growing blood cells, nurseries for the genesis of new blood. In Carla's marrow, this organization had been fully fucking destroyed. Sheet after sheet of malignant blasts packed the marrow space, obliterating all anatomy and architecture, leaving no space for any production of blood. Carla was at the edge of a physiological abyss. Her red blood cell count had dipped so low that her blood was unable to carry its full supply of oxygen. Her headaches, in retrospect, were the first sign of oxygen deprivation. Her platelets, the cells responsible for clotting blood, had collapsed to nearly zero, causing her bruises. Her treatment would require extraordinary finesse. She would need chemotherapy to kill her leukemia, but the chemotherapy would collaterally decimate any remnant normal blood cells. We would push her deeper into the abyss to try to rescue her. For Carla, the only way out would be the way through. Ooh, what suspense. Ooh, what contrast. What seemingly aversion of reason. Ooh, that's very poetic. I like such. I feel like I'm doing a reaction video, but like old school, because it's a fucking book instead of a actual video. Alright, let's fucking finish this. We got what? 2 pages? No, 3 pages. No, 2 pages left. Sorry. Sidney Farber was born in Buffalo, New York in 1903, 1 year after Virchow's death in Berlin. His father, Simon Farber, a former bargeman in Poland, had immigrated to America in the late 19th century and worked in an insurance agency. The family lived in modest circumstances at the eastern edge of town, in a tight-knit, insular, and almost economically precarious Jewish community of shop owners, factory workers, bookkeepers, and peddlers. Pushed relentlessly to succeed, the Farber children were held to high academic standards. Yiddish was spoken upstairs, but only German and English were allowed downstairs. The elder Farber often brought home textbooks and scattered them across the dinner table, expecting each child to select and master one book, then provide a detailed report for him. Sydney, the third of 14 children, thrived in this environment of high aspirations. Damn. 14. 14. You fucking... 14 is a number you give when you make up how many babies you had. That's not the actual number. I refuse to believe that. Really. He studied both biology and philosophy in college and graduated from the University of Buffalo in 1923, playing the violin at music halls to support his college education. Fluent in German, he trained in medicine at Heidelberg and Freiburg. Then, having excelled in Germany, found a spot as a second-year medical student at Harvard Medical School in Boston. The circular journey from New York to Boston via Heidelberg was not unusual. In the mid-1920s, Jewish students often found it impossible to secure medical school spots in America, often succeeding in European, even German, medical schools before returning to study medicine in their native country. It's 1920. Wasn't that fucking very close to World War II? Farber thus arrived at Harvard as an outsider. His colleagues found him arrogant and insufferable, but he too, relearning lessons that he had already learned, seemed to be suffering through it all. He was formal, precise, and meticulous, starched in his appearance and his mannerisms, and commanding in his presence. He was probably nicknamed Four-Button Sid for his propensity for wearing formal suits to his classes. Four-Button Sid. I wish I had a nickname like that. Farber completed his advanced training in pathology in the late 1920s and became the first full-time pathologist at the Children's Hospital in Boston. He wrote a marvelous study on the classification of children's tumors and a textbook, The Post-Mortem Examination, widely considered a classic in the field. By the mid-1930s, he was firmly ensconced in the back alleys of the hospital as a preeminent pathologist, a doctor of the dead. Yet the hunger to treat patients still drove Farber, and sitting in his basement laboratory in the summer of 1947, Farber had a single inspired idea. He chose, among all cancers, to focus his attention on one of its oddest and most hopeless variants, childhood leukemia. To understand cancer as a whole, he reasoned, you need to start at the bottom of its complexity, in its basement. Ooh, love the parallel. And despite its many idiosyncrasies, leukemia possessed a singular attractive feature. It could be measured. Science begins with counting. To understand a phenomenon, a scientist must first describe it. To describe it objectively, he must first measure it. If cancer medicine was to be transformed into a rigorous science, then cancer would need to be counted somehow, measured in some reliable, reproducible way. In this, leukemia was different from nearly every other type of cancer. In a world before CT scans and MRIs, quantifying the change in size of a terminal solid tumor in the lung or the breast was virtually impossible without surgery. You could not measure what you could not see. But leukemia, floating freely in the blood, could be measured as easily as blood cells by drawing a sample of blood or bone marrow and looking at it under a microscope. If leukemia could be counted, Farber reasoned, then any intervention, a chemical sense circulating through the blood, say, could be evaluated for its potency in living patients. He could watch cells grow or die in the blood and use that to measure the success or failure of the drug. He could perform an experiment on cancer. The idea mesmerized Farber. In the 1940s and 50s, young biologists were galvanized by the idea of using simple models to understand complex phenomena. Complexity was best understood by building from the ground up. Single-celled organisms such as bacteria would reveal the workings of a massive multicellular animals such as humans. What is true for E. coli, a microscopic bacterium, the French biochemist Jacques Monod would grandly declare in 1954, must also be true for elephants. For Farber, leukemia epitomized this biological paradigm. From the simple, atypical beast he would extrapolate into the vastly more complex world of other cancers. The bacteria would teach him to think more about the elephant. He was, by nature, a quick and often impulsive thinker, but here too, he made a quick, instinctual leap. The package from New York was waiting in his laboratory that December morning. As he tore it open, pulling out the glass vials of chemicals, he scarcely realized that he was throwing open an entirely new way of thinking about cancer. My breath stinks. And that's our first chapter done. How we doing? 41 fucking minutes. Oh my god. Oh, I've been wasting time. Oh shit. Alright, I don't know if I can do much else if that took 41 minutes. Let's go. Come on. I know my throat is kind of complaining right now, and I'm hearing overtones in my voice, but let's go. A monster more insatiable than the guillotine. That's the title of the second chapter, and here's two quotes again. The medical importance of leukemia has always been disproportionate to its actual incidence. ... Indeed, the problems encountered in the systemic treatment of leukemia were indicative of the general directions in which cancer research as a whole was headed. That's Jonathan Tucker in Ellie, A Child's Fight Against Leukemia. And the other is, there were few successes in the treatment of disseminated cancer. It was usually a matter of watching the tumor get bigger and the patient progressively smaller. And there was John Laszlo, The Cure for Childhood Leukemia, Into the Age of Miracles. Oh, that's a spoiler. We cured that shit. Number one, that's great. And number two, I'm not supposed to learn that. This is supposed to be a drama. This is supposed to be a suspenseful book. If I already know it's already solved, then fuck no, like you just ruined the tension for me, man. Alright. Let's go. Sidney Farber's package of chemicals happened to arrive at a particularly pivotal moment in the history of medicine. In the late 1940s, a cornucopia of pharmaceutical discoveries were tumbling open in labs and clinics around the nation. The most iconic of these new drugs were the antibiotics. Penicillin, that precious chemical that had to be milked to its last droplet during World War II, was by the early 50s being produced in 1,000-gallon watts. In 1939, the drug was re-extracted from the urine of patients who had been treated with it to conserve every last molecule. In 1942, when Merck had shipped out its first batch of penicillin, a mere 5.5 grams of the drug, that amount had represented half of the entire stock of the antibiotic in America. A decade later, penicillin was being mass-produced so effectively that its price had sunk to 4 cents per dose, 1/8 the cost of a half-gallon of milk. New antibiotics followed in the footsteps of penicillin. Chloramphenicol in 1947, tetracycline in 1948. In the winter of 1949, when yet another miraculous antibiotic, streptomycin, was purified out of a clod of mold from a chicken farmer's barnyard, Time magazine splashed the phrase, "The remedies are in our own backyard," prominently across its cover. In a brick building on the far corner of Children's Hospital, in Fiber's own backyard, this book keeps on amazing me. A microbiologist named John Enders was culturing poliovirus in rolling plastic flasks, the first step that culminated in the development of the Sabin and Salk polio vaccines. New drugs appeared at an astonishing rate. By 1950, more than half the medicines in common medical use had been unknown merely a decade earlier. Perhaps even more significant than these miracle drugs, shift in public health and hygiene also drastically altered the national physiognomy of the illness. What the fuck is that word? Typhoid fever, a contagion whose deadly swirl could decimate entire districts in weeks, melted away as the putrid water supplies of several cities were cleaned by massive municipal efforts. Even tuberculosis, the infamous white plague of the 19th century, was vanishing, its incidence plummeting by more than half between 1910 and 1940, largely due to better sanitation and public hygiene efforts. The life expectancy of Americans rose from 47 to 68 in half a century, a greater leap in longevity than had been achieved over several previous centuries. The sweeping victories of post-war medicine illustrated the potent and transformative capacity of science and technology in American life. Hospitals proliferated. Between 1945 and 1960, nearly 1,000 new hospitals were launched nationwide. Between 1935 and 1952, the number of patients admitted more than doubled, from 7 million to 17 million per year. And with that rise in medical care came the concomitant expectation of medical cure. As one student observed, when a doctor has to tell a patient that there is no specific remedy for his condition, the patient is apt to feel affronted or to wonder whether the doctor is keeping abreast of the times. In new and sanitized suburban towns, a young generation thus dreamed of cures, of a death-free, disease-free existence. Lulled by the idea of the durability of life, they threw themselves into consuming durables. Boat-sized Studebakers, rayon leisure suits, televisions, radios, vacation homes, golf clubs, barbecue grills, washing machines. Oh, those are all consuming durables. In Levittown, a sprawling suburban settlement built in a potato field on Long Island, a symbolic utopia, illness now ranked third in a list of worries, falling behind finances and child rearing. In fact, rearing children was becoming a national preoccupation at an unprecedented level. Fertility rose steadily. By 1957, a baby was being born every 7 seconds in America. The affluent society, as the economist John Galbraith described it, also imagines itself as eternally young, with an accompanying guarantee of eternal health, the invincible society. And that's our first fucking break. Oh my goodness. It's pretty much a break every page here. What in the world? Let's go. My nose is so stuffed. This might affect how I speak. I'm sorry. But of all diseases, cancer had refused to fall into step in this march of progress. If a tumor was strictly local, i.e., confined to a single organ or site so that it could be removed by a surgeon, the cancer stood a chance of being cured. Extirpations, as the procedures came to be called, were a legacy of the dramatic advances of 19th century surgery. A solitary malignant lump in the breast, say, could be removed via a radical mastectomy pioneered by the great surgeon William Halsted at Johns Hopkins in the 1890s. With the discovery of X-rays in the early 1900s, radiation could also be used to kill tumor cells at local sites. But scientifically, cancer still remained a black box, a mysterious entity that was best cut away en bloc rather than treated by some deeper medical insight. To cure cancer, if it could be cured at all, doctors had only two strategies: excising the tumor surgically or incinerating it with radiation. A choice between the hot ray or the cold knife. Ooh, hot and cold. Ooh, that's very nice. In May 1937, almost exactly a decade before Farber began his experiments with chemicals, Fortune magazine published what it called a panoramic survey of cancer medicine. The report was far from comforting. The startling fact is that no new principle of treatment, whether for cure or prevention, has been introduced. The methods of treatment have become more efficient and more humane. Crude surgery without anesthesia or asepsis has been replaced with modern painless surgery with its exquisite technical refinement. Biting caustics that ate into the flesh of past generations of cancer patients have been obsolesced by radiation with X-ray and radium. But the fact is that cancer cure still includes only two principles: the removal and destruction of diseased tissue, the former by surgery, the latter by X-rays. No other means have been proved. The Fortune article was titled "Cancer, the Great Darkness," and the darkness the author suggested was as much political as medical. Cancer medicine was stuck in a rut not only because of the depth of medical mysteries that surrounded it, but because of the systematic neglect of cancer research. There are not over 24 funds in the U.S. devoted to fundamental cancer research. They range in capital from about $500 up to about $2 million, but their aggregate capitalization is certainly not much more than $5 million. The public willingly spends a third of that sum in an afternoon to watch a major football game. Wow. Shame. This stagnation of research funds stood in stark contrast to the swift rise to prominence of the disease itself. Cancer had certainly been present and noticeable in 19th century America, but it had largely lurked in the shadow of vastly more common illnesses. In 1899, when Roswell Park, a well-known Buffalo surgeon, had argued that cancer would someday overtake smallpox, typhoid fever, and tuberculosis to become the leading cause of death in the nation, his remarks had been perceived as a rather startling prophecy, the hyperbolic speculations of a man who, after all, spent his days and nights operating on cancer. But by the end of the decade, Park's remarks were becoming less and less startling, and more and more prophetic by the day. Typhoid, aside from a few scattered outbreaks, was becoming increasingly rare. Smallpox was on the decline. By 1949, it would disappear from America altogether. Meanwhile, cancer was already outgrowing other diseases, ratcheting its way up the ladder of killers. Between 1900 and 1916, cancer-related mortality grew by 29.8%, edging out tuberculosis as a cause of death. By 1926, cancer had become the nation's second most common killer, just behind heart disease. Cancer, the Great Darkness, wasn't alone in building a case for a coordinated national response to cancer. In May that year, Life carried out its own dispatch on cancer research, which conveyed the same sense of urgency. The New York Times published 2 reports on rising cancer rates in April and June. When cancer appeared on the pages of Time in July 1937, interest in what was called the cancer problem was like a fierce contagion in the media. And that's another break. How many do we have left? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Oh. Just 7 pages left here. One, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh. And the next one is only 5. Okay, I have a plan. Let's go. 56 minutes. Oh boy. Let me drink some water first. My throat's been unbearable today. Alright, let's go. Proposals to mount a systematic national response against cancer had risen and ebbed rhythmically in America since the early 1900s. In 1907, a group of cancer surgeons had congregated in the New Willard Hotel in Washington to create an organization to lobby Congress for more funds for cancer research. By 1910, this organization, the American Association for Cancer Research, had convinced President Taft to propose to Congress a national laboratory dedicated to cancer research. But despite initial interest in the plan, their efforts had stalled in Washington after a few fitful attempts, largely because of a lack of political support. In the late 1920s, a decade after Taft's proposal had been tabled, cancer research found a new and unexpected champion, Matthew Neely, a dogged and ebullient former lawyer from Fairmont in West Virginia, serving his first term in the Senate. Although Neely had relatively little experience in the politics of science, he had noted the marked increase in cancer mortality in the previous decade, from 70,000 men and women in 1911 to 115,000 in 1927. Neely asked Congress to advertise a reward for $5 million for any information leading to the arrest of human cancer. It was a lowbrow strategy, the scientific equivalent of hanging a mugshot in the sheriff's office, and it generated a reflexively lowbrow response. Within a few weeks, Neely's office in Washington was flooded with thousands of letters from quacks and faith healers purporting every conceivable remedy for cancer: rubs, tonics, ointments, anointed handkerchiefs, salves, and blessed water. Congress, exasperated with the response, finally authorized $50,000 for Neely's cancer control bill, almost comically cutting its budget back to just 1% of the requested amount. In 1937, The indefatigable Neely, re-elected to the Senate, launched yet another effort to launch a national attack on cancer, this time jointly with Senator Homer Bone and Representative Warren Magnuson. By now, cancer had considerably magnified in the public eye. The Fortune and Time articles had fanned anxiety and discontent, and politicians were eager to demonstrate a concrete response. In June, a joint Senate-House conference was held to craft legislation to address the issue. After initial hearings, the bill raced through Congress and was passed unanimously by a joint session on July 23, 1937. 2 weeks later, on August 5th, President Roosevelt signed the National Cancer Institute Act. The act created a new scientific unit called the National Cancer Institute, or NCI, designed to coordinate cancer research and education. An advisory council of scientists for the institute was assembled from universities and hospitals. A state-of-the-art laboratory space with gleaming halls and conference rooms was built among leafy arcades and gardens in suburban Bethesda, a few miles from the nation's capital. The nation is marshaling its forces to conquer cancer, the greatest scourge that has ever assailed the human race, Senator Bone announced reassuringly while breaking ground for the building on July 3, 1938. After nearly 2 decades of largely fruitless efforts, a coordinated national response to cancer seemed to be on its way at last. All of this was a bold, brave step in the right direction, except for its timing. By the early winter of 1938, just months after the inauguration of the NCI campus in Bethesda, the battle against cancer was overshadowed by the tremors of a different kind of war. In November, Nazi troops embarked on a nationwide pogrom against Jews in Germany, forcing thousands into concentration camps. By late winter, military conflicts had broken out all over Asia and Europe, setting the stage for World War II. By 1939, those skirmishes had fully ignited, and in December 1941, America was drawn inextricably into the global conflagration. This war necessitated a dramatic reordering of priorities. The U.S. Marine Hospital in Baltimore, which the NCI had once hoped to convert into a clinical cancer center, was now swiftly reconfigured into a war hospital. Scientific research funding stagnated and was shunted into projects directly relevant to the war. Scientists, lobbyists, physicians, and surgeons fell off the public radar screen. Mostly silent, as one researcher recalled, their contributions usually summarized in obituaries. An obituary might as well have been written out for the National Cancer Institute. Congress's promised funds for a programmatic response to cancer never materialized, and the NCI languished in neglect. Outfitted with every modern facility imaginable in the 1940s, the Institute's sparkling campus turned into a scientific ghost town. One scientist jokingly called it a nice quiet place out here in the country. In those days, the author continued, it was pleasant to drowse under the large sunny windows. The social outcry about cancer had also drifted into silence. After the brief flurry of attention in the press, cancer again became the great unmentionable, the wished-about disease that no one spoke about publicly. In the early 1950s, Fanny Rosenow, a breast cancer survivor and cancer advocate, called the New York Times to post an advertisement for a support group for women with breast cancer. Rosenow was put through, puzzlingly, to the society editor of the newspaper. When she asked about putting her announcement, a large pause followed. I'm sorry, Miss Rosenow, but the Times cannot publish the word breast or the word cancer on its pages. Perhaps, the editor continued, you could say there would be a meeting about diseases of the chest wall. Rose now hung up, disgusted. And now we have another break. Kind of languid right now. Alright, let's go. When Farber entered the world of cancer in 1947, the public outcry of the past decade had dissipated. Cancer had once again become a politically silent illness. In the airy words of the Children's Hospital, doctors and patients fought their private battles against cancer. In the tunnels downstairs, Farber fought an even more private battle with its chemicals and experiments. This isolation was key to Farber's early success. Insulated from the spotlights of public scrutiny, he worked on a small, obscure piece of the puzzle. Leukemia was an orphan disease, abandoned by internists who had no drugs to offer for it, and by surgeons who could not possibly operate on blood. Leukemia, as one physician put it, in some senses, had not even been cancer before World War II. The illness lived on the borderlands of illnesses, a pariah lurking between disciplines and departments, not unlike Farber himself. If leukemia belonged anywhere, it was within hematology, the study of normal blood. If a cure for it was to be found, Farber reasoned, it would be found by studying blood. If he could uncover how normal blood cells were generated, he might stumble backwards into a way to block the growth of abnormal leukemic cells. His strategy, Jen, was to approach the disease from the normal to the abnormal, to confront cancer in reverse. Much of what Farber knew about normal blood he learned from Georges Minot. A thin, balding aristocrat with pale, intense eyes, Minot ran a laboratory in a colonnaded brick and stone structure off Harrison Avenue in Boston, just a few miles down the road from the sprawling hospital complex on Longwood Avenue that included Children's Hospital. Like many hematologists at Harvard, Farber had trained briefly with Minot in the 1920s before joining the staff at Children's. Every decade has a unique hematological riddle, and for Minot's era, that riddle was pernicious anemia. Anemia is the deficiency of red blood cells, and its most common form arises from a lack of iron, a crucial nutrient used to build red blood cells. But pernicious anemia, the rare variant that Minot studied, was not caused by iron deficiency. Indeed, its name derives from its intransigence to the standard treatment of anemia with iron. By feeding patients increasingly macabre concoctions, half a pound of chicken liver, half-cooked hamburgers, raw hog stomach, and even once the regurgitated gastric juices of one of his students, spiced up with butter, lemons, and parsley. What the fuck? Minot and his team of researchers conclusively demonstrated in 1926 that pernicious anemia was caused by the lack of critical micronutrient, a single molecule later identified as vitamin B12. Why the fuck did one of his students have to vomit up gastric juice to prove that shit? Never mind. In 1934, Minot and two of his colleagues won the Nobel Prize for this path-breaking work. Minot had shown that replacing a single molecule could restore the normalcy of blood in this complex hematological disease. Blood was an organ whose activity could be turned on and off by molecular switches. There was another form of nutritional anemia that Minot's group had not tackled, an anemia just as pernicious, although in the moral sense of that word. 8,000 miles away, in the cloth mills of Bombay, owned by English traders and managed by their cutthroat local middlemen, wages had been driven to such low levels that the mill workers lived in abject poverty, malnourished and without medical care. When English physicians tested these mill workers in the 1920s to study the effects of this chronic malnutrition, they discovered that many of them, particularly women after childbirth, were severely anemic. This was yet another colonial fascination. To create the conditions of misery in the population, then subject it to social or medical experimentation. In 1928, a young English physician named Lucy Wills, freshly out of the London School of Medicine for Women, traveled on a grant to Bombay to study this anemia. Wills was an exotic among hematologists, an adventurous woman driven by a powerful curiosity about blood, willing to travel to a faraway country to solve a mysterious anemia on a whim. She knew of Minot's work, but unlike Minot's anemia, she found that the anemia in Bombay couldn't be reversed by Minot's concoctions or by vitamin B12. Did she also feed them the gastric juices of one of her students? I hope not. Astonishingly, she found she could cure it with Marmite, the dark yeasty spread, then popular among health fanatics in England and Australia, which could not determine the key chemical nutrient of Marmite. She called it the Wills factor. The Wills factor turned out to be folic acid, or folate, a vitamin-like substance found in fruits and vegetables, and amply in Marmite. When cells divide, they need to make copies of DNA, the chemical that carries all the genetic information in a cell. Folic acid is a crucial building block for DNA, and is thus vital for cell division. Since blood cells are produced by arguably the most fearsome rate of cell division in the human body, more than 3 billion cells a day, the genesis of blood is particularly dependent on folic acid. In its absence, in men and women starved of vegetables, as in Bombay, the production of new blood cells in the bone marrow halts. Millions of half-matured cells spew out, piling up like half-finished goods bottlenecked in an assembly line. The bone marrow becomes a dysfunctional mill, a malnourished biological factory oddly reminiscent of the cloth factories of Bombay. That's clever, dude. Ooh, fuck now. This guy's a poet. Yeah.
Hey, are you going to turn off the heater?
I have it timed already.
Okay.
These links between vitamins, bone marrow, and normal blood kept Farber preoccupied in the early summer of 1946. In fact, his first clinical experiment, inspired by this very connection, turned into a horrific mistake. Lucy Wills had observed that folic acid, if administered to nutrient-deprived patients, could restore the normal genesis of blood. Farber wondered whether administering folic acid to children with leukemia might also restore normalcy to their blood. Following that tenuous trail, he obtained some synthetic folic acid, recruited a cohort of leukemic children, and started injecting folic acid into them. In the months that passed, Farber found that folic acid, far from stopping the progression of leukemia, actually accelerated it. In one patient, the white cell count nearly doubled. In another, the leukemia cells exploded into the bloodstream and sent fingerlings of malignant cells to infiltrate the skin. Farber stopped the experiment in a hurry. He called this phenomenon acceleration, evoking some dangerous object in free fall careening towards its end. Pediatricians at Children's Hospital were furious about Farber's trial. The folate analogs had not just accelerated leukemia, they had likely hastened the death of the children. But Farber was intrigued. If folic acid accelerated the leukemia cells in children, what if he could cut off its supply with some other drugs? An anti-folate. Could a cell that blocked the growth of white blood cells stop leukemia? The observations of Minot and Wills began to fit into a foggy picture. If the bone marrow was a busy cellular factory to begin with, then the marrow occupied with leukemia was that factory in overdrive. It deranged the manufacturing unit for cancer cells. Minot and Wells had turned the production lines of the bone marrow on by adding nutrients to the body. But could the malignant marrow be shut off by choking the supply of nutrients? Could the anemia of the mill workers in Bombay be recreated therapeutically in the medical units of Boston? Oh, the anemia itself. Is he just gonna starve them? What the fuck? In his long walks from his laboratory under Children's Hospital to his house in Amory Street in Brooklyn, Farber wondered relentlessly about such a drug. Dinner, in the dark wood-paneled rooms of the house, was usually a sparse, perfunctory affair. His wife, Norma, a musician and writer, talked about the opera and poetry. Sidney, of autopsies, trials, and patients. As he walked back to the hospital at night, Norma's piano tinkling practiced scales in his wake. The prospect of an As he walked back to the hospital at night, Norma's piano tinkling practiced scales in his wake. The prospect of an anti-cancer chemical haunted him. He imagined it palpably, visibly, with a fanatic's enthusiasm, but he didn't know what it was or what to call it. The word chemotherapy, in the sense we understand it today, had never been used for anti-cancer medicines. The elaborate armamentarium of antivitamins that Farber had dreamed up so vividly in his fantasies did not exist. Farber's supply of folic acid for his disastrous first trial had come from the laboratory of an old friend, a chemist, Yelapragda Subbaraw, or Yella, as most of his colleagues called him. Yella was a pioneer in many ways, a physician turned cellular physiologist, a chemist who had accidentally wandered into biology. His scientific meanderings had been presaged by more desperate and adventuresome physical meanderings. He had arrived in Boston in 1923, penniless and unprepared, having finished his medical training in India and secured a scholarship for a diploma at the School of Tropical Health at Harvard. The weather in Boston, Yella discovered, was far from tropical. Unable to find a medical job in the frigid, stormy winter, as he had no license to practice medicine in the United States, he started as a night porter at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, opening doors, changing sheets, and cleaning urinals. The proximity to medicine paid off. Subbaraw made friends and connections at a hospital and switched to a day job as a researcher in the division of biochemistry. His initial project involved purifying molecules out of living cells, dissecting them chemically to determine their composition. In essence, performing a biochemical autopsy on cells. The approach required more persistence than imagination, but it produced remarkable dividends. Subbaraw purified the molecule called ATP, the source of energy in all living beings. ATP contains chemical energy in the cell, and another molecule called creatine, the energy carrier in muscle cells. Any one of these achievements should have been enough to guarantee him a professorship at Harvard. But Subbaraw was a foreigner, a reclusive, nocturnal, heavily accented vegetarian, who lived in a one-room apartment downtown, befriended only by other nocturnal recluses such as Farber. In 1940, denied tenure and recognition, Yella huffed off to join the Darrell Labs, a pharmaceutical laboratory in upstate New York, owned by the American Cynamid Corporation, where he had been asked to run a group on chemical synthesis. At Ladero, Yellis Subaru quickly reformulated his old strategy and focused on making synthetic versions of the natural chemicals that he had found within cells, hoping to use them as nutritional supplements. In the 1920s, another drug company, Eli Lilly, had made a fortune selling a concentrated form of vitamin B12, the missing ingredient in pernicious anemia. Subaru decided to focus his attention on the other anemia, the neglected anemia of folate deficiency. But in 1946, after many failed attempts to extract the chemical from pigs' livers, he switched tactics and started to synthesize folic acid from scratch with the help of a team of scientists. The chemical reactions to make folic acid brought a serendipitous bonus. Since the reactions had several intermediate steps, Subaru's team could create variants of folic acid through slight alterations in the recipe. These variants of folic acid, closely related molecular mimics, possessed counterintuitive properties. Enzymes and receptors in cells typically work by recognizing molecules using their chemical structure. But a decoy molecular structure, one that nearly mimics the natural molecule, can bind to the receptor or enzyme and block its action, like a false key jamming a lock. Some of Yella's molecular mimics could thus behave like antagonists to folic acid. These were precisely the antivitamins that Farber had been fantasizing about. Farber wrote to Subaru asking him if he could use the folate antagonists on patients with leukemia. Subaru consented. In the late summer of 1947, the first package of antifolate left Lader's labs in New York and arrived in Farber's laboratory. Fucking hell. I know the next chapter is only 5 pages, but my throat is more than complaining. It's actually pain. It's actually painful. And oh my god, it's 1 hour 22. Yeah, I'm fucking done for today. So, goodbye.